Okay, let me do some background concepts to introduce the dialogue for today, the Platonic dialogue. Okay, so last time, if you remember, we were talking about the Meno in our Zoom call. Okay, and if you remember, we talked about the slave boy example in the middle of the dialogue, this very famous example, where the slave boy solves a geometry problem, right? The geometry problem is to find an area, a square that is twice the size and area of an initial square. And the answer is to take the diagonals of 4 squares, and the square in the middle is actually twice the size and area of the initial square. Okay, but the slave boy is not able to solve this problem initially. By the end of the incident, he is able to solve the problem. I suggested one interpretation is that the slave boy had a jumble of disorganized experiences which become organized by virtue of Socrates' questions. Plato's view is that actually what's going on is the slave boy is recollecting ideas that he already had in his head. Okay, ideas that precede experience. Okay, and Plato's got this wild view that we had this pre-bodily life. Prior to embodiment, our souls existed in the realm of the forms. And remember, the forms are concepts. Don't think of this as a physical realm. The forms are concepts. And for Plato, all things have forms. Okay, there are forms of tables and chairs. There are forms of physical objects. There are forms of abstract objects like justice or kindness or love. There are forms of colors. There are forms of numbers. All things have forms, okay? And so Plato thinks that our souls had pre-bodily existence in the realm of the forms. Now, let's discard that view for a minute. And let's retain the notion that our minds come with prepackaged knowledge. Okay, that part of the view at least, which is a view that actually a lot of philosophers down through the centuries have held. Basically, in the world of philosophy, the subfield of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, what can I know, how can I know it, what are the limits of and scope of my knowledge, how much can I trust what I know. Subfield of epistemology is divided into 2 camps. One is the camp called empiricism. The other is the camp called rationalism. And these are 2 camps with differing views on the source of the ideas that we have in our minds. Okay, the empiricism camp, which counts a number of famous philosophers in its ranks, including the founding father, intellectually at least, of the United States, John Locke, who's a famous empiricist, but also other famous empiricists like one we'll study in this class, David Hume, George Berkeley, other people like that. The empiricists say every idea that we have in our minds comes from our experiences, our sensations of the world, our physical experiences. We don't have any ideas in our minds that aren't originally traceable to our experiences. Okay, so when you see the word empiricism, think empirical, which means experiential. Okay, experiential. And the empiricists say everything that we can think, every thought that we can think is some sort of reflection of or rearrangement of the ordinary, everyday sensory experiences that we have as human beings. Okay, the rationalism view is the view that there are some ideas in our minds that precede experience. In other words, there are some notions or beliefs or ideas that we have that are not traceable just to our sensory experiences, but rather that precede experience. Our minds come prepackaged with these sorts of ideas. An example might be mathematics or geometry. Some philosophers, I'm not necessarily one of them, but some philosophers think that knowledge of God precedes experience, that we know that there is a divine being prior to experience. I don't necessarily agree with that, but it is a view that a lot of philosophers down through the centuries have held. Okay, so the empiricists say every idea in our minds, all of our knowledge, comes from experiences ultimately, and the rationalists say some ideas precede experience. Okay, let's all take our cell phones and put our cell phones out in front of us on the table face down. Let's make a habit of this every class period. Put your cell phone out in front of you face down. Please do not text, do not surf, do not answer your phone in any way. We'll just make a habit of focusing on class during this time period. Okay? All right. Now, having said that, I'm going to pivot away from the Meno. That's a wrap-up issue that I wanted to draw out of the Meno as a dialogue. It's a dialogue where extensive discussion of epistemology takes place in the context of a reflection on the questions, what is virtue and can virtue be taught? Okay, I'm going to pivot from that, and I'm going to do some background investigations today. Is there no eraser up here? Oh, is it because of COVID?
I think you can use the spray that's over there, maybe.
And it probably doesn't work. I'll use my good old-fashioned eraser. Okay, now, we're going to do some background issues with regard to the Phaedo. Okay, so that's the main topic for today. That was just a wrap-up issue from the Meno. The Phaedo is a dialogue where we encounter Socrates on his last day of life. Okay, and he has this dialogue with his friends and disciples as they discuss the nature of death and what death is, and they talk about the soul and whether the soul is immortal. Okay, let me start off by asking you guys a question. We're going to do an intuitive exercise here for a few minutes in lecture. And actually, let me ask it this way. Do you have a soul? Before we talk about whether the soul is immortal, let's ask whether the soul exists. And by soul, I mean a conscious part of you that's not reducible to physical stuff. Some sort of non-physical, conscious, call it intellectual component, call it what you will, spiritual component, some aspect of you that's not just reducible to physical stuff. Do you have a soul? Do you guys think you have a soul? You sure? Where is it? I mean, I can see you guys' physical bodies. You can see mine. I can see this lectern. I can see that desk. I can't see your soul. How do you know you got one? Do you just feel like you got one? There must be some non-physical aspect to you.
I feel that soul can definitely be, in my personal opinion, interchangeable with a conscience. Whereas, you know you have it, you know that it's there.
Sure.
It definitely guides you in your way of being and how you interact with others. Therefore, I think we know that we have this conscience. We know we have this voice that kind of makes up, you know, some people's feelings, that makes up our being towards and our interactions and how we behave towards external interactions, you know, devoid of, you know, not devoid of, apart from what we do in our internal,
Sure.
internal problems. And
Sure.
therefore, I think in that point we can say that our conscience is somewhat like our soul, whereas, you know, some people do not have that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Great. That's a great comment. So I happen to think that you do have souls. I happen to think I have a soul. Think about it in these terms. What is the difference between you and the table you're sitting at?
We are living cognitive creatures. We are aware.
Absolutely. You know you exist and the table doesn't know it exists. Yeah. So there's something about you that enables you to know that you are a physical being. And the table doesn't know it's a physical being. So that's something about you that enables you to know that you are a physical being. Presumably, call it a soul, call it what you will, it is something that is beyond just the merely physical, that enables you to know that you are a physical thing. Right? Kendrick?
I like to liken the soul to, let's say, faith, or let's say you can faith in general, your belief in something, or belief in religion, or it could even be similar to, let's say, love.
Uh-huh.
They're not tangible, they're not physical, we can't touch them, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist
Sure.
necessarily. Perhaps our soul resides in the realm of forms, like you said.
Sure.
Maybe it's, yeah.
Okay, good. I personally happen to think that there are all sorts of things that have real existence that aren't actually physically observable. For instance, consider abstract concepts like love. I'm in love with my wife. But you know what? It's not something that you can see or taste or touch or smell. It doesn't have physical components to it. Is it a real thing then, or is it just a fiction that we talk about?
I think love is one of those things that a person thinks that there is something that you personally cannot observe because you are the one that's experiencing it, but it can be externally observed by way of the way you look at it, the way you touch it, the way you interact with it. And I think
Good. Okay.
that would definitely, but absolutely, like you can't prove that you're in love with her. If put on the spot, you get nervous, you get embarrassed, and you're like, right.
Right.
So I guess it doesn't. I guess to a point, it does make it, not observable in a sense.
Plato's view, the view of all the Greeks, in fact, was that humans do have souls, but that these souls are not directly observable. They are observable by their effects. You can see someone's soul by virtue of its effects. So, for instance, you can see my soul as I wave my arms in front of you. Not directly, indirectly. It's like, on the Greek view, it's like the wind blowing the leaves in the trees. You can't see the wind directly, but you can see its effects. You can see its impact on that which is around it. That's the Greek view of how you observe the soul, what the soul is, what the soul happens to be. Bradley mentioned abstract concepts like love, or things that you can see by their effects. Justice. Does justice exist? Is it a real thing? When we say justice was done in this particular court case, are we just talking about a fiction? Because it obviously doesn't have physical existence. Kendrick?
We can see instances of it.
Could see instances of it.
Over to number 3. We can't see 3, but we can see 3 things.
Yeah. Good. Okay, yeah. And the Platonic view is that there is a concept of justice, and you can see instances of it. And those instances have meaningfulness to them by virtue of their participation in the Platonic understanding of justice. Okay, so I happen to think I have a soul. Plato thought we have souls. The answer to this question, do you have a soul, is yes on the Platonic view, and the reason why is because the soul is observable by its effects. Now, in the history of philosophy, there have been 2 views on this. One view is called Dualism, and the other view is called Monism. And by soul, all I'm talking about here is a non-physical component to us as human beings. Call it consciousness, call it soul, some aspect of us that's not describable or reducible to physical elements only. On the dualist view, this is what almost everybody is intuitively. Okay? Non-reflectively, before we started talking about this, almost everybody in this class, probably everybody actually, was a dualist. The dualist view says there are 2 things that humans are made up of, souls and bodies. And these 2 things come together in a composite, a soul-body composite. And the soul inhabits the body. And they work together seamlessly. So seamlessly that the different aspects of body impact soul, and the different aspects of soul impact body. Okay, so if you think about it, your soul for sure shapes your body. Okay, and by soul, I just mean that conscious part of you.
I think a great example would be somebody who's depressed.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's where I was going to go. Yep.
Through dramatic changes,
Mm-hmm.
where, for instance, for me, I gained 25 pounds after, I was medically discharged because my plan was to be, and my lifelong plan was to be part of the military for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So, tell me, what, you gotta go. And then I was sitting at 165, and by the time I got out and everything struck, within 2 months, I gained so much weight that it was just like, wow,
Yeah, absolutely. And the example I was going to use was people who are happy throughout their lives. The stats show they live longer lives, substantially longer lives, than people who live their lives sad and depressed. It's quite startling, actually, when you actually look at the statistical studies. Soul pretty clearly impacts body. Body impacts soul, right? So you're trying to focus and concentrate on your studies, but you're just so hungry or so sleepy. You just fall asleep, right? Or that guy in the row ahead of you is just so cute, it's hard to focus on the lecture. Right? Body impacts soul, doesn't it? It shapes our thinking. And it's hard to get away from the physical components of ourselves that shape the conscious aspects of us. Okay, the dualist view is the classical Greek view. It is also the classical Christian view. And it is the view that we are bodies and souls, body-soul composites. That is how we have been made. And these body-soul composites work together seamlessly. There's some objections to the dualist view, though. The big objection, I'll just highlight one here, is the interactionism problem. Or the interaction problem, just for short. If really humans are made up of two things, souls and bodies, how do they interact with each other? What's the connection there? Think of it this way. Think of an example of a completely non-physical thing, like a ghost. The movies are wrong. If a ghost tries to open a door, ghost can't do it, right? Because the ghost is not physical. Ghost just passes through. So if there's an aspect to us that is non-physical, that's just consciousness, then how does that connect up to something that's physical? It seems like a mystery, right? It's certainly not something that can be scientifically. And again, I'm not talking here about the scientific story we could tell about physical things impacting physical things. Okay, so for instance, let me just give you an example. My mind is thinking the thought, move your arm, and my arm is moving. Now, we could tell a story about how neural pathways are firing in my brain. These neural pathways stimulate certain muscle groups in the musculoskeletal system. Nerves stimulating muscle groups. The muscle groups lift the bone structure and my arm moves. We could tell a story like that. But where the science stops is the connection between my sensation of the thought, move your arm, and those neural pathways lighting up and the musculoskeletal structure being stimulated. The science is not able to describe or to bridge the gap between the first person sensation that I have in my mind when I think the thought, move your arm, and the physical, quite clearly physical thing that moving your arm involves. Does everybody kind of follow that? It's like we're able to go so far with the science. We can look at certain parts of the brain firing up, but again, that is not the same as thinking the thought, move your arm. There's a difference there between the external perspective, seeing the brain's neural pathways firing up, and the internal perspective, thinking the thought. Okay, if you're still having trouble here, think of the difference between the way we use the two words brain and mind. Okay, brain suggests that third person, external perspective where you're looking at some physical object. Mind suggests an internal first person perspective where you are thinking the thought from the inside, as it were. Okay, so how do they interact? If we are really two things, how do these two things interact with each other? It's a mystery, right? That's the great problem with dualism, is like, where's the interaction? Yeah, Bradley.
So something I've been thinking about as we've gone through, it kind of pops in my head is like, I don't know if you've ever been on a virtual reality headset. For me, there's something that's called phantom touch, where you could feel where a person's touching you even though they're nowhere near you. And I think, our perception is like, some people are very, very perceptive to other people's feelings, to the atmosphere, to the stuff like that. I think in a sense we all have that with our soul and our body. That way, it just kind of we feel it. It's intuition.
Yeah, well, most people intuitively are definitely dualists. In fact, everybody is, basically. Before you actually think about it, everybody is definitely a dualist. We all non-reflectively are dualists. Yeah, Kendrick.
In a way, I like to think of our bodies as kind of like, let's say, a jar. We're just physical vessel that contains our soul. Once we die, we don't take our bodies with us. Our body just decomposes. But then our consciousness goes somewhere. At least that's what I think. It's like, we're a vessel.
That's actually a very Greek view.
Oh.
Yeah.
If that vessel gets damaged enough, well, then we die. Our soul leaves. I don't know. That's my perspective.
Okay, good. That's a very Greek view. We'll talk about whether that view is correct. Obviously, nobody knows precisely what happens at death and after death, but we'll talk about different views. Okay, monism is the major alternative. It's arisen out of problems like the interaction problem, although there are other similar sorts of problems. Monism can be divided into two views. Okay, physicalism and idealism. We'll start with physicalism. The physicalist view is that human beings are not two things, we are one thing, just bodies. We're just bodies. Okay, and that sensation that you have of a first personal experience of consciousness that is different than the physical is a kind of a fiction that maybe supervenes upon the physical. It's a fiction that is not empirically ascertainable or discernible. It's something that just feels like it is the case, but all that you really are is just body. Okay, and physicalists, most of the time physicalists are hard-bitten atheist types who say, look, there's just the empirical, just the physically observable. There's no non-physical stuff that has real existence. But not always. But most of the time physicalists hold to those views. The other view, this is kind of weird, it is actually a possible view. Okay, this could be the way the world is. The other view is idealism, and that's the view that that we're just souls, that bodies are illusory. You guys ever seen The Matrix? Yeah? The idealist view is that we're in the Matrix. And it could be right. It could actually be right. You can't ever get outside your mind and prove that there's a real physical world with real existence. I'm not talking about solipsism. I'm not talking about it's just me or just you that exists and all this is a figment of your imagination. Okay, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about idealism, which is the view that they're just souls and bodies are illusory. Bodies don't actually have real existence. Okay, think about it this way. You can't ever get outside of your mind to encounter the world physically without some sort of a mental vessel to serve as the intermediary, right? You can't ever encounter the world physically directly, can you? So the idealists say, why should we actually believe that such a world exists? Maybe it's just minds. Okay, so maybe an easy way to get at this problem is the famous philosophical conundrum. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around, no conscious being is around, no human is around, does it make a sound? And the idealists say, no, it does not. And you're like, wait, of course it does. But think about it. No, it doesn't. There's no conscious being to experience it. And the idealist view is that it takes consciousness to have meaningful existence, to have existence at all. Right? Because it takes consciousness to be aware. And so in the idealist view, we are all just minds and bodies are actually illusory. You can be an idealist and a theist, actually. So a very famous idealist in history, George Berkeley, believed that we are all minds encompassed by or within the mind of God. Okay? So now, idealists could be right. I happen to be a dualist, probably because my own sensibilities are always toward common sense thinking rather than toward some exotic theory. Idealists could be right, though. I mean, we could all be in the matrix. We just can't prove otherwise. Like, it is a consistent view. Okay, questions or comments about any of these views on what a human being is? So we could ask the question underneath here, do you have a soul? We could ask the question, what is a human being? So we could try to define a human being. And the answers we would get would be the dualist view and then the monist view, which can be split into physicalism and idealism. Those would be the answers to the question, what is a human being?
Do you think that a human being can be a concept both of dualism and monism in the same concept?
How would that be possible?
I think so.
Okay.
Because we do have soul and body, but there are a lot of people that in order for their souls or their conscious to be, and for me, I'm going to use soul, conscious as a soul. For the conscious to be somewhat affected or affected at all, they have to have some physical interaction which physicalism is, we're just bodies. We are defined by those.
Yeah.
And I feel that definitely can be an idea that both dualism and monism exist within a person.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, and we're all instinctively dualists.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, well, the dualist view is definitely that we have both a physical component and a non-physical component. This whole view, thank you for that comment, this whole view comes especially into sharp relief when we ask a further question, which is the question that is driving the Phaedo. And it's the question that Socrates and his friends throughout the dialogue are wrestling with. And that is the question, what is death? So let me offer some possibilities. Okay, what is death? You guys didn't know we were going to go this deep in the first residential class, did you? It is philosophy class, so yeah. That's right. Yeah, you gotta go deep if you're gonna go and get anything insightful. Okay, what is death? Possibility number one. Death is just the end, full stop. Okay, this could be the case. This is the end of your conscious existence. There's nothing afterwards. This was your life, your existence. Think about it this way. So they don't really have these kinds of funerals anymore, but when I was a little kid, they were, as kind of the tail end of the funerals where they would do this, they would have open casket funerals. Okay, nowadays everybody wants to be cremated. Okay, but they would have open casket funerals, and you could see the dead person's body up there at the front of the church sanctuary during the funeral. And people these days think that that's spooky, although I didn't find it spooky at all when I was a little kid. But okay, so Granny's up there at the front of the church sanctuary. Is that Granny? It's her body. Is that Granny?
Yeah, I think it's so.
No, really?
In all sense,
That's not Granny.
I think so.
That's worm food.
Yeah.
It's just like worm food. Like it's gonna be like whatever that is. It's just a physical stuff that's gonna decompose, right?
Eventually, but I think in that moment, in that sense, she is still Granny, right? Because even though
She doesn't know she's Granny.
You're right, but you do.
So are we projecting on her the thought that that's Granny?
Yeah, I do believe so.
Okay.
The projection definitely does put into although
Some people do hold the view that we have consciousness because we are perceived in the eyes of others. Because others perceive us as such. But I mean, like, think about it though, man. I'm pressing you on this, but think about it for a second. Right? So it strikes me just intuitively that, like, that's just a physical thing up there. That's not really, like, Granny at that point.
So I do agree with
Kendrick.
That eventually our souls do leave the body and go to whatever whatever religion you are, but at that moment, because we perceive that person, that body, to be Granny, she is still Granny though. Although she is not moving, although she is not physically conscious, she's not there. We are all aware that she's Granny.
Okay.
Therefore, she is still Granny.
Okay.
Man,
the awareness of others that was Granny makes it so Granny. Interesting position. I'm not sure if it's consistent. If we had time, I think I might be tempted to try to press you a little further on that. Okay. Here's an alternative, a transition, and I'm going to offer a couple of different interpretations of what such a transition could be. Okay, so pretty clearly a body dies at death. That seems to be pretty clearly the case. But dualists have argued that if we're more than just bodies, if we are souls too, then how do we know that the soul also dies at death? Okay, some might say, well, the soul supervenes upon the body. The soul exists within the body. It supervenes upon the body. Without the body, the soul loses its habitat and it passes away as well. Okay, remember in the dialogue they talk about music making with the harp. You guys, I hope read the dialogue. Yes, music making with the harp. If the harp goes away, the lyre, right? Then the melody stops. Music stops. Okay. So that could be the case. Could be the case. However, it could also be the case that the soul lives on. It succeeds the body. It continues to have existence even after the body dies. Okay, so that's one possibility. Is soul continues, and that's the Socratic view. Socrates thinks his soul is immortal. He thinks he's got arguments in the Phaedo for why his soul is immortal. Okay, he thinks that his soul will live on after the death of his body because there are philosophical arguments that demonstrate its continued existence. Okay, there's also another view, which is the resurrected body view, which is that we get new bodies, which we can't see now, but which we are promised in the Christian scriptures. Okay, I happen to think that existence in heaven is a bodily existence. I think that there is substantive evidence for this in the Christian scriptures, that it's a bodily existence, which means that we will have bodies like this. If that view is correct, we will have bodies like this, but just perfected and not subject to any of the foibles that we have these days. Okay, but let's go back and let's look at this. Pretty clearly, this whole view, the transition view, that death is not the end, but rather a transition to another form of existence. Pretty clearly, the burden of proof is on that view. Okay, because what we can see is kind of the end. Like what we can see when we observe a body is like pretty clearly the physical end. So the burden of proof is on this view to demonstrate that there's something beyond the end when death happens. Okay, and Socrates' view is that he's got a soul. He thinks that his soul is demonstrable by the means that I suggested a minute ago. And he thinks that his soul continues. There's this worry in the dialogue that the soul will actually be trapped in the body upon death if one has not done the right kinds of things to discipline the soul, to deny it certain physical desires so that it becomes more otherworldly. It's a very Platonic kind of approach to these things. But Socrates offers several arguments for the immortality of the soul. Okay, these are all famous arguments. I should tell you guys straight out right here at the beginning, before we look at some of these arguments, I should tell you straight out, I find none of them convincing. I am not convinced by Socrates' arguments for the immortality of the soul. I do think my soul is immortal, but not for the reasons that Socrates says. The only reason I think my soul is immortal is because I am told in the Christian scriptures that my soul is immortal. I don't think that you can use natural arguments to prove the immortality of the soul, but Socrates tries, okay, and you can think of what he's doing in these terms. But actually, let me pause. I've been talking for a long time. Let me pause and ask if there are questions or comments about any of these things so far.
I don't quite remember Socrates' arguments on how his soul continues.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
We'll look at a couple in a minute.
I think one thing that I think the transition, now that we've gone over it, is definitely something that happens, and experiences are that you have, I've read stories, I've heard stories about how some children, toddlers, and kids that are barely learning to speak, have these memories that there's no way, right? It's memories from people would suggest past lives or, some dreams or whatnot. But, the soul continues. I'm going to focus on that one. I think that the soul does somewhat continue, but not in the sense where it continues living on.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense that, though with every interaction, and I want to say more towards our immediate family, that we have left a part of our souls to them, and they carry out some way or some sort that in remembrance of that person, and therefore that soul somewhat still lives on, even if in memory.
Sure. Yeah. So Socrates is not just talking about memory, though. He thinks that the soul has real existence even apart from the recollection of others. So there are some people who say, well, death is the end, except insofar as we have immortality in the recollection of others of our existence. But certainly, I think it would only be meaningful immortality if we ourselves were aware of it as our own existence. So if the soul only exists because other people remember it or think about it, then I don't think that would be meaningful. Speaking personally, I don't think that would be meaningful immortality. But it's worth thinking about or contemplating. Okay, several arguments that are provided. One is the recycling argument. I call it the recycling argument. It's the argument that they're talking about in the extensive passages where they're discussing how hot comes from cold and waking from sleeping. Those complex passages where they're talking about how opposites come from each other. Think of it in terms of this. Think of it as the recycling argument. Okay. And it looks like I'm only going to have time to run through one argument today. You'll have to watch the video for the other, or I might be able to get it to you in another way. Okay, the recycling argument is as follows. If you look around you in the world, it's pretty clear that when things end their existence as what they are now, they don't just end entirely. Okay, so for instance, this building right now, Atwood 2. Someday, it will be a pile of rubble. Okay, but when it does become a pile of rubble, it will not just cease to exist entirely. It will be remade into something else. Okay, your car is currently your car, but someday it'll just be a bunch of junkyard parts. Okay, and I name my cars and have relationships with my cars, so that will be difficult for me. But when your car does become a bunch of junkyard parts, it will not just cease to exist entirely. Those parts will be remade into other things. Okay, and so Socrates reasons, well, it stands to reason that if everything else we observe doesn't just cease to exist entirely when it ends this particular lifespan that it has, why wouldn't the soul be the same? In other words, maybe the soul just gets recycled. Maybe it doesn't continue as what it is right now, but maybe it continues in some other way. Because everything else that we observe on this earth does continue in some other way. It just doesn't cease to exist entirely. Okay, speaking personally, I find that argument unconvincing. I think that Socrates is making a category error here. Okay, recall that Plato, speaking, as through Socrates, Socrates is the voice of Plato in these dialogues. Recall that Plato was a dualist. He thinks that there are souls and there are bodies, and humans are soul-body composites. Plato seems to be using characteristics of bodies and ascribing them to souls. I think that's a category error. I think just because all the physical stuff that we see around us gets recycled doesn't mean that the non-physical component of us, whatever that non-physical component is, gets recycled as well. So that's why I'm unconvinced by the recycling argument, because I think a category error is being made here. And I think that Socrates, as Plato's mouthpiece, is ascribing falsely, I think, the characteristics of bodies to non-physical things, namely souls. Let me stop. I'm only going to have time for one of the Platonic arguments for the immortality of the soul, and ask if there are questions or comments on the recycling argument. Okay? Questions or comments in general on the things we've been talking about. You guys think we're in the Matrix? Why not?
I think, so I have this conversation a lot with some of my buddies that are super conspiracy theorists.
Right, okay.
One of my favorite arguments with them is that their favorite argument is the deja vu.
Okay.
Right? If you don't know what deja vu is, it's when you know you've done something, you're like, wait, I've been here before. Right? They believe that one of the theories is that we cross over to another dimension, another part of a present.
Oh man, that is wild.
Yeah, super quad, right? That
I've encountered a bunch of oddball philosophical theories. I mean, I am a philosopher after all. But yeah, I mean that's a pretty wild one.
Yeah, it's like they think that when you die, that's what happens. You go to different dimensions.
Right.
Body.
Okay. Sure.
And so just to keep it short,
Interesting.
that's like a very, very brief, much down.
Yeah.
Conversation.
Cool. Well, these are big picture issues. None of these can be settled, but there are definitely different views that have been held by very respectable people down through the centuries. Stay tuned. More Platonic arguments for the immortality of the soul will be forthcoming, probably on the video. Okay, and I will see you guys next week. It is great to get to know you all.